They said the stars themselves bowed to Trantor, that a single voice from the imperial palace could command half the galaxy to kneel. They said the empire would last forever, but eternity, it seems, always has an expiration date. So here's the question. Why do civilizations that conquer time and space always collapse faster than they rose? Why does progress, once it reaches perfection, begin to eat itself alive? Maybe the answer lies here, beneath a roof of steel that wraps an entire world. Trantor, the capital of the first Galactic Empire, a planet-turned city, a world that forgot the feel of soil. From orbit, it glows like a silver jewel, every continent plated in metal, every ocean sealed beneath the architecture of ambition. 40 billion souls breathe in its recycled air, feeding the engines of a bureaucracy that stretches from the core to the rim. It's beautiful, terrifyingly so, and it is already dying. This story isn't about rebellion or invasion or heroes with laser blades. It's about something slower, deeper, the rot that begins not with war, but with comfort, the decay that hides beneath the illusion of order. You can already hear it in the hum of Trantor's underground turbines, the sound of a machine that can never be switched off. From the highest spire of the imperial palace, the emperor gazes across the domed horizon, a sea of domes and towers stretching beyond sight. He rules 1,000,000 worlds. Yet his throne rests on equations he does not understand. Equations written by a man named Hari Seldon, the mathematician who looked into the future and saw the end. But before we reach him, we need to understand what he saw, because the seeds of collapse were already there, hidden in the empire's perfection. Every empire believes its rise is unique. Every empire tells itself that its story will not repeat history. The Romans thought so. The Ottomans thought so. The British thought so. Even our own civilizations today, the ones that stretch across digital empires and invisible borders, believe the same lie. That growth is forever. That decline happens to someone else. But in the galaxy of foundation, the lie has gone interstellar. Trantor's rulers control every flow of information. The Ministry of Population knows the name of every child born in every province. The Ministry of Audit tracks every credit spent on every world. Data flows upward, layer upon layer, until it reaches the Imperial Library, a cathedral of knowledge so vast that its indexes require their own bureaucracy to maintain. It is a civilization drowning in its own memory. And yet, the more it knows, the less it understands. Because knowledge has become paperwork, innovation has become ritual, science has become the property of titles, not minds. Every experiment requires a permit. Every discovery must be stamped and filed. What began as a galaxy of explorers has turned into an empire of clerks. In the lower levels of Trantor, beneath the shining palaces, maintenance crews work in the heat of fusion conduits that have run for centuries. They don't know how the systems were built, only how to keep them from failing. Manuals replace understanding. Tradition replaces reason. That's how decline begins. Not with a single explosion, but with the slow forgetting of why the lights stay on. And yet, on the surface, everything seems eternal. Imperial processions march through halls of marble so polished they reflect the starlight. Senators deliver speeches no one listens to. The economy flows in perfect rhythm, the way a pendulum swings, steady, predictable, confident in its momentum. But pendulums don't swing forever. Somewhere, deep in the university sector, a quiet mathematician is teaching equations that will one day terrify emperors. Hari Seldon speaks of psychohistory, the science of predicting the future of entire civilizations through mathematics. To his students, it sounds impossible. To the emperor's spies, it sounds dangerous. But Seldon's equations tell a story no one wants to hear. The empire is not stable. Its collapse is not centuries away. It is inevitable and imminent. He can't predict who will cause it. Not individuals, not assassins, not rebels. Psychohistory doesn't care about names. It cares about numbers, about trends, about the collective behavior of billions who will make the same small decisions over and over until the sum of their actions becomes fate. That's what makes it terrifying, because once the math is done, you realize that the fall of Trantor isn't a tragedy, it's an equation. The paradox of power is simple. The stronger a civilization becomes, the more fragile it grows. Trantor has solved hunger, disease, distance. It has mapped every star worth naming, but it cannot solve boredom. It cannot fix arrogance. It cannot quantify the decay that comes when people stop questioning why the world works. So when the first signs of failure appear, a delayed shipment of ore from the rim, a famine in a frontier world, a minister caught selling permits, the empire doesn't panic. It just adds more bureaucracy, more paperwork, more control. It tightens its grip, and in doing so, begins to suffocate. This is how all empires end, not with conquest, but with the silence of routine. We can see it in our own time, can't we? The way progress breeds complacency, the way power blinds itself to its own limits, the way we convince ourselves that more data, more systems, more control will save us. But what if the math says otherwise? What if the bigger a civilization becomes, the faster it must fall? From the skies of Trantor, fleets still rise toward the stars, massive ships with banners gleaming under artificial sunlight. The empire expands, even as its heart hollows out. Somewhere beyond the core, on forgotten frontier worlds, traders and governors begin to act more like kings. Provincial armies swear loyalty to themselves. The edge worlds grow restless, and yet the emperor still believes his throne is eternal. He is surrounded by advisors who speak in half-truths, courtiers who fear honesty more than treason. Because in the heart of Trantor, truth is the one thing that can start a revolution. Hari Seldon knows that revolution isn't the answer. Chaos only prolongs the darkness. But if he can plan the fall, if he can predict the cycle, maybe he can guide humanity through it. Not to stop the collapse, but to shorten it. He calls it the Seldon Plan, a 1,000-year blueprint hidden inside the ruins of empire. Two foundations at opposite ends of the galaxy, one to preserve knowledge, the other to preserve the mind itself. But to the empire, it sounds like treason. And soon, Seldon will be brought before the emperor's court to answer a single question. If the empire is eternal, why does your math say it's already dead? The story of Trantor begins here, in the shining capital of 1,000,000 worlds, where perfection itself becomes the instrument of downfall. Because the higher a civilization climbs, the harder it falls. And somewhere in that fall lies the only hope for humanity's future. It began, as all empires do, with a dream of order. Not conquest, not greed, order. A dream that from chaos could come structure, from division could come unity. In the archives of the first Galactic Empire, there's a record of the first unification charter. A simple line of text transmitted across the stars, signed by a coalition of 100 worlds. They called it the Accord of Humanity. It was idealistic, fragile, but it carried the force of destiny. Over the next 5 centuries, the Accord evolved into dominion. Trade routes became arteries, fleets became law, science became conquest. Humanity's expansion turned from curiosity to compulsion, and at its center rose Trantor, a world chosen not for its beauty or resources, but for its position at the heart of the Milky Way's spiral. Symbolically perfect, strategically irresistible. The early architects didn't set out to cover a planet. That happened over time, like ivy creeping across a forgotten temple. The first continental capitals merged their networks, cities fused into megacities, and eventually the stars themselves bent toward Trantor's gravity. The empire's greatest engineers promised that no matter how vast the bureaucracy grew, no message would take longer than a day to reach the throne. That promise, like all great visions, would later become a curse. Trantor's construction was not just a feat of engineering, it was a declaration of philosophy. Every dome, every level, every kilometer of reinforced steel said the same thing: humanity had outgrown nature. Why rely on the unpredictable rhythms of weather or soil when you could build your own? Beneath the surface, titanic furnaces melted and recycled entire continents. Oceans were drained and replaced by coolant seas. Mountains were leveled, their minerals consumed to feed the never-ending hunger of the metropolis. At its peak, Trantor's expansion consumed 1 billion tons of material each day. Freight barges from 1,000 worlds arrived in a synchronized ballet, guided by traffic controllers who operated like gods. Entire ecosystems were stripped to sustain the machine. Planets that once thrived on agriculture became barren supply nodes. But it worked. For 12,000 years, it worked. The Empire became the most stable civilization in human history. Wars dwindled, disease vanished. Every citizen was documented, categorized, archived. The concept of frontier disappeared. There was no edge left to conquer. And for a time it seemed humanity had finally broken free of its cycle. But history has a strange sense of irony. The moment an empire completes itself, it begins to die. The philosophers of the early dynasties warned of this. They wrote, "When there are no more worlds to claim, the empire must turn inward, and it will find the enemy waiting there." They were right. By the 10th millennium, the empire's expansion had slowed to a crawl. Colonies stopped paying taxes. Bureaucratic ministries became hereditary. Innovation faded under the weight of stability. The empire still believed in its own momentum, but like a ship running on leftover fuel, it was only coasting. Still, the spectacle remained intoxicating. Imagine the imperial capital during its golden age, kilometer-tall towers crowned with gold, skyways connecting continents, fleets of silver starships lifting off from orbital launch domes. From the core to the rim, every child was taught that Trantor was eternal, that the light of the empire could never dim. But behind the grandeur, the same equations that built the empire were already calculating its end. Hari Seldon would later prove it with mathematics, but long before his birth, the signs were visible. The empire had become too vast to govern, too complex to reform. Each new system of control only spawned 2 more in its place. The chain of command stretched so far that no one at the top truly understood what happened below. The dream of order had consumed itself, and so, even as the empire reached its maximum height, it was already in descent. A slow, invisible fall, masked by ceremony, hidden behind ritual, postponed by denial. Because when you're standing on a mountain that high, it's hard to believe you're falling. The rise of Trantor was not just a story of ambition, it was the story of humanity's most seductive illusion, that power and progress can be made permanent. But permanence is the one thing history never grants. Walk the streets of Trantor at its zenith, and you can feel the heartbeat of the empire in every vibration of the steel beneath your feet. The air smells faintly of ozone and polished metal. Day and night blur together under the glow of artificial suns, thousands of them embedded in the city's domed ceilings, simulating the passage of time. Above ground, everything gleams. The palace district floats on layers of crystal platforms. Gardens bloom under temperature-controlled domes, each flower genetically coded to remain in perfect symmetry. The aristocracy hosts banquets that last for days, each course prepared by robotic artisans whose designs haven't changed for centuries. From orbit, the planet looks like a single living organism, light pulsing through its arteries, glowing brighter where the administrative sectors work through the night, but descend a few thousand levels and the illusion shatters. Down there, the air grows thick with the scent of oil and human exhaustion. The light is colder, the sound constant, a drone of turbines and ventilation shafts. Maintenance crews move through tunnels so old no one remembers when they were built. Some sectors are sealed off entirely, abandoned after ancient systems failed, and no one dared to repair them. Trantor is a city of 1 billion secrets, most of them buried beneath the surface. And yet it functions. Somehow, impossibly, it works. Every flicker of light, every data stream, every breath of conditioned air, coordinated by algorithms so old that no living engineer truly understands them. It's efficient, but it's hollow. The Empire doesn't innovate anymore. It maintains. And in that maintenance lies the first whisper of decay. You can almost hear it in the rhythm of modern cities today. Data centers replacing landscapes. Bureaucracies growing faster than the problems they were built to solve. Every new regulation birthing two more loopholes. Every innovation turning inward to sustain itself rather than change the world. The parallels aren't accidental. Trantor is not fiction, it's prophecy. Every empire believes it can outsmart entropy. Every nation believes it can control the tide. But the truth is, the universe rewards adaptation, not permanence. The longer something refuses to change, the more brittle it becomes. That's what Trantor forgot. The Empire's citizens no longer looked outward. Curiosity had been replaced by pride. Art had become formulaic. Literature, nostalgic. Science, bureaucratic. Even the stars themselves, once symbols of hope, became little more than coordinates in a database. And yet, in the surface districts, the illusion of glory was total. The capital broadcast its splendor to every world. Holographic parades, propaganda operas, news feeds proclaiming infinite prosperity. The Empire's decline was not visible because its noise was so loud. You could walk through the grand plazas of the imperial palace and think, this will last forever. The glass towers shimmer. The fountains sing. The banners of 1,000 provinces flutter in the artificial wind. But if you listen carefully, you can hear the hum beneath the beauty, the sound of systems running too long without rest. The same sound our own world makes when it runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The quiet, invisible cost of endless growth. Trantor didn't fall because it was corrupt. It fell because it was tired. The philosophers of the final dynasties called it the fatigue of civilization. When progress becomes routine, when exploration turns to maintenance, when innovation becomes a department, decline begins. It's not a collapse. It's a sleepwalk. The people of Trantor didn't notice the rot because it was disguised as success. The metrics still looked good, the reports still promised efficiency, the graphs still pointed upward, and yet, beneath that comforting data, something fundamental was failing: meaning. What was all this machinery for? Why did the Empire still build, still consume, still expand when it had already conquered everything? That question, never asked, never answered, became the ticking clock beneath the surface. In the lower conduits, a maintenance worker named Pell drags his toolkit through a corridor where the lights flicker every few seconds. He's been assigned to Sector 243 for years. The system runs perfectly, until one day it doesn't. He opens a control panel and finds ancient components stamped with dates no one recognizes. The manuals tell him how to replace them, not why they work. He follows the instructions, the system restarts, and the light steadies. Another small victory for the Empire, but as he walks away, Pell wonders, not for the first time, what would happen if no one came to fix it next time. Above him, a young bureaucrat named Leora delivers her daily report to the Ministry of Audit. She's proud of her efficiency. Her supervisors praise her for reducing errors in her district's tax filings by 0.2%. It takes her 6 months to realize no one ever reads the reports she sends. The data disappears into the administrative void, processed, stored, forgotten. At night, she looks out across the glowing skyline and whispers, "What are we doing all this for?" The city doesn't answer. In the upper tiers, a visionary architect named Marin oversees a new project: the construction of a ceremonial plaza on top of the old industrial sectors. The Empire calls it beautification. Marin calls it erasure. He's ordered to demolish entire neighborhoods, pave them over with marble, and install fountains that will never run out of water. When he protests, his superiors remind him that aesthetics are a form of control. People don't revolt in beautiful cities. they tell him. But Marin sees what lies beneath, the cracks spreading through foundations, the rust creeping into the steel. He designs his plaza anyway, because refusal would mean exile. Still, he embeds a hidden message in the geometry of the plaza's layout, a pattern that, when viewed from orbit, resembles a fracture line, and far across the galaxy, a colonial governor on a dusty frontier world stops receiving shipments from Trantor. The ports are empty, the communications relays slow, the Empire blames the sunspots, the governor knows better. He begins to mint his own currency, enforce his own laws. For the first time, the Rim forgets what the Core's voice sounds like. That's how decay begins, one missed transmission at a time. Back on Trantor, Hari Seldon's lectures begin to draw quiet attention. His students whisper that he's found a pattern in history, a curve that no empire can escape. He shows them models of rise and fall, overlaid on civilizations long gone. The equations are clear, terrifying in their simplicity. And yet, the most powerful government in history continues to build, expand, rise. Because that's what empires do. They rise until they can't. One evening, Seldon leaves the university and looks out across the endless city. The glow of a billion lights fills the horizon. It looks eternal, divine, indestructible. And yet, he knows it's already over. He writes in his notes, "The Empire's end is not an event. It is a process, a rise that forgot to stop rising." Below him, the turbines hum, the city breathes, and somewhere deep underground, in the silence between the machines, the future begins to whisper. It began as a question, not of politics or morality, but of mathematics. Hari Seldon had no intention of becoming a prophet. He was a scientist, one who preferred the certainty of numbers to the chaos of people. Yet it was people, billions of them, who became the variables in his greatest equation. In the early years of his research, Seldon wasn't chasing destiny. He was chasing curiosity. He wanted to know if history, seemingly random, full of wars and miracles and betrayals, could be predicted. Could the movements of nations, the collapse of empires, the rise of ideologies all follow a pattern? Could the future be graphed like the arc of a comet? It was a dangerous question in a civilization built on the illusion of permanence.
His colleagues at Streeling University called him eccentric. "You can't quantify history," they told him. "People aren't particles." But Seldon was patient. He built his model one dataset at a time: birth rates, trade routes, energy output, the number of bureaucratic departments per world. It was tedious work, but the more he fed the equations, the more the chaos began to settle into shape. Patterns emerged. Always the same: growth followed by stagnation, centralization followed by decay, expansion followed by collapse. The intervals varied, but the curve, the shape, was identical every time. He called it the entropic slope. At first, he thought he'd made a mistake. The numbers were too neat, too cruel. The equations didn't predict that the empire might fall. They proved it must. It wasn't ideology. It wasn't corruption. It wasn't a single emperor's failure. It was arithmetic. Every civilization that grew beyond its capacity to adapt entered the same decline. The bigger the system, the slower it could respond. The slower it responded, the faster entropy won. Trantor, the shining capital of 1,000,000 worlds, was already past the inflection point. The collapse was inevitable and irreversible. Seldon's models ran simulations stretching tens of thousands of years into the future. He calculated a dark age lasting 30,000 years before humanity could rebuild to its current level of civilization. 30 millennia of ignorance, violence, and isolation. He worked in silence, staring at that number, 30,000, longer than any recorded history before the Empire, longer than memory itself. But then another question arose, the question that would define the rest of his life. If the collapse cannot be stopped, can it be guided? That's when psychohistory was born. Seldon began to treat humanity as a vast system of probabilities. Individuals were unpredictable,
but large populations followed consistent behavioral trends. A single person's choice was random. The actions of a trillion were inevitable. It was the law of averages scaled to civilization itself. To test his theory, he ran historical reconstructions of past empires: Earth's Rome, Byzantium, the British Federation, the pre-core republics. Every simulation ended the same way: concentration of power, overextension, decay, fall. He had found the rhythm of history, the mathematical heartbeat of civilization. But like any scientist standing too close to the truth, he became a danger. When Seldon presented his results at the Decennial Congress of Mathematics, it wasn't the applause he remembered, it was the silence. The Imperial Commission ordered his notes confiscated. His funding was revoked. Within weeks, he was summoned to appear before the Commission of Public Order, accused of spreading destabilizing predictions. The Empire feared him not because of his politics, but because he had reduced destiny to arithmetic. He was forced into hiding, continuing his work in secret with a small circle of students. They called themselves the psychohistorians. Together, they refined the plan, a vast project to record all human knowledge and preserve it through the coming darkness. Their goal wasn't to stop the fall, but to shorten it, from 30,000 years to just 1,000. To most, it sounded like heresy. To Seldon, it was the only hope left. And he knew time was running out. Psychohistory was more than math. It was faith disguised as logic. It rested on a paradox that the future could be predicted, but never by those who lived within it. To understand it, you have to imagine the galaxy as a single living organism. Every human act, every law, every rebellion becomes part of a grand equation. The individual is noise, the mass is signal. It's not cynicism, it's scale. One person is chaos, a trillion create patterns. Seldon often compared it to thermodynamics. No one can predict the movement of a single molecule, but you can predict the pressure and temperature of the gas they form. So too with societies. The more people there are, the less free will matters. It's a beautiful idea, and a horrifying one. The philosophy behind it cut to the core of human identity. If the future can be known, do we still have choice? Or are we merely participants in equations written long before we were born? Seldon wrestled with that question for years. He wanted to believe in free will, but the math refused to obey belief. In the equations, choice existed only as noise, a deviation so small it could be averaged out. Individuals could alter nothing. The collective always returned to the curve. Still, he hoped. He built the Seldon plan on a paradoxical faith, that humanity could be saved precisely because individuals believed they had free will, even when the outcome was already written. He never called it fate, he called it prediction, but the difference to those who didn't understand was indistinguishable.
If this sounds abstract, consider our own age. We live surrounded by systems that already echo Seldon's logic. Algorithms predicting what we'll buy, who will love, how we'll vote. Models that forecast pandemics, market crashes, wars. The more data we generate, the more predictable we become. We call it convenience. We call it insight. But at what point does prediction become control? Modern psychohistory doesn't wear the robes of mathematicians. It wears the skin of code. Machine learning, behavioral modeling, neuroeconomics, all variations of the same ancient question. Are we free or are we data? Seldon's genius was not in inventing control, but in revealing that it already existed. Civilization itself is a pattern of control. Every law, every norm, every currency, systems designed to make the unpredictable predictable. What he did was quantify the endgame, and the endgame was coming faster than anyone imagined. His latest simulations showed exponential acceleration in the empire's instability metrics, declining productivity, increasing bureaucracy, regional isolation, corruption in trade networks. The empire was falling, not in centuries, but in decades. The numbers were clear.
But the closer Seldon got to the truth, the more dangerous he became. Philosophers accused him of determinism. Religious leaders called him blasphemous. Politicians labeled him subversive. Even his friends begged him to stop publishing, but Seldon had already seen too far. He once said, "If a man sees a wall collapsing, does he stop warning others because they don't want to believe him?" He knew belief wouldn't save anyone. Only preparation would. So he turned his mathematics into a plan, a map through the ruins. He called for the creation of the Foundation, a colony on the galaxy's edge, far from the politics of Trantor, tasked with preserving the sum of human knowledge in an Encyclopedia Galactica. It would be the seed of the next civilization. But Seldon's vision didn't end there. Secretly, he designed a second foundation, hidden, unseen, its purpose not to preserve knowledge, but to preserve the plan itself, because he knew that somewhere, somehow, chaos would find a way back in. The day of Seldon's trial arrived under an artificial dawn. The great chamber of judgment was filled with senators, ministers, and the shadow of the emperor himself. Outside, the city's domes shimmered with quiet anticipation. Inside, one man stood against 12,000 years of certainty. Seldon was old now, his hair silver, his voice steady but tired. Beside him stood Gall Dornick, his young apprentice, clutching a data slate filled with the plan's projections. The chief commissioner began, "Professor Seldon, you are charged with inciting panic, spreading false prophecies, and undermining imperial unity. Do you deny these charges?" Seldon smiled faintly. "I deny nothing. But perhaps you misunderstand me. I have not predicted your fall. I have merely measured it." Laughter rippled through the chamber, nervous and short. He continued, unfazed. "The Empire is dying. Its collapse is inevitable, but we can reduce the chaos that follows from 30,000 years to a single millennium. That is the purpose of the Foundation." The commissioner leaned forward. "And who appointed you custodian of the future?" "No one," Seldon said softly, "but the future doesn't need permission." The trial turned into theater. Senators accused him of treason. Scholars called his work pseudoscience, but every attack only strengthened the inevitability of his vision. The more they mocked him, the more they revealed their fear. When the sentence was read, exile to Terminus, a barren world at the edge of the galaxy, Seldon bowed his head in relief. They thought they were silencing him. They were, in truth, granting him exactly what he wanted, freedom from Trantor's decay. He and his followers were placed on transport ships, each carrying libraries of knowledge, machines, data cores, and the hope of civilization reborn. The journey took months. When the fleet finally landed on the icy plains of Terminus, the colonists stepped out beneath a pale sky and saw the future stretching endlessly before them. There were no palaces, no domes, just wind, silence, and stars. They began to build. Years passed. Seldon's health declined, but his plan evolved. Hidden in vaults across Terminus, he recorded holographic messages, one for every Seldon crisis the Foundation would face. At each turning point, the recordings would appear, guiding future generations along the path of survival. He called it the psychohistorical roadmap of destiny. On Trantor, his name became a curse. Officials erased him from the archives. The Empire declared victory over the false prophet. Yet quietly, even within the bureaucracies, whispers persisted. What if he was right? And then, slowly, the signs began to appear. Trade faltered, provinces rebelled, communications slowed. What had been theory became prophecy. The Empire had begun to unravel. In his final years, Seldon stood outside the Foundation's central dome, watching the horizon fade into the dark. His apprentice asked if he ever regretted creating the plan. "No," Seldon said. "Regret is for those who think they can stop what's coming. I only hope we remember enough to begin again." He died quietly, surrounded by the same data he once used to predict the end of worlds. Centuries later, the Empire would burn. Trantor would fall. And in the ruins of its bureaucracy, no one would remember the man who had already seen it all coming. But somewhere, far on the edge of the galaxy, the Foundation would endure. Its people would look to the stars and whisper his name, half curse, half prayer, Hari Seldon, the man who turned the future into mathematics. The first Foundation began not as a temple, but as a colony of scientists. They arrived on Terminus with blueprints, not scriptures, with laboratories instead of altars. Yet within a few generations they would discover that the surest way to control chaos was not through logic, but through belief. It began innocently enough. The encyclopedists were builders, archivists, mathematicians. They believed the Empire's collapse was temporary and that knowledge itself could anchor civilization through the coming dark. But as the Empire's communication routes withered, Terminus found itself isolated. Supply ships stopped arriving. The colonies once loyal to Trantor broke away, each forming their own petty kingdoms. The Foundation's leaders faced a simple truth: reason alone could not unite the galaxy's fragments. Their scientific superiority was undeniable, but power was nothing without obedience, and obedience required faith. So they created one. Under Salvor Hardin's leadership, science was recast as sanctity. The Foundation's technology, atomic power, energy shields, field converters, was presented to the surrounding worlds not as engineering, but as miracles granted by the galactic spirit. The priests of this new religion were technicians in robes, performing rituals of sacred maintenance. The manuals became scriptures. The laboratories became temples. And it worked. The barbarian kingdoms that had once dismissed Terminus as a remote outpost now knelt before it in reverence. Foundation ambassadors arrived not as diplomats, but as missionaries. They spoke the language of faith, yet the faith was built entirely upon forgotten science. A malfunctioning reactor became a divine punishment. A repaired power grid, a holy blessing. To the Foundation, this was a calculated illusion, religion as a technology of control. But for the rest of the periphery, it was revelation. Within a century, the Foundation's influence had spread across dozens of worlds. No empire had been restored, but something subtler had taken its place, a network of belief bound by dependence. The Foundation ruled not through armies, but through awe. Salvor Hardin's maxim became doctrine. Violence is the last refuge of the incompetent. And beneath it, unspoken but understood, faith is the first refuge of the powerful. In public, the leaders called themselves stewards of civilization. In private, they understood what they had built. A system as stable as any empire, but rooted not in truth, only in perception. The Foundation had inherited Seldon's mission: to preserve knowledge. But to survive, it had done something Seldon might never have predicted. It had weaponized ignorance. The great irony was that this deception ensured the plan's continuation. Each priest who worshipped atomic fire kept the reactors running. Each congregation that feared divine wrath maintained the power grid. Faith became function, and knowledge, carefully rationed, became the most sacred secret of all. Religion, in the Foundation's hands, was not an accident. It was policy. To walk through the holy cities of the periphery was to see technology wrapped in ritual. Starships landed on consecrated pads. Engineers performed prayers before adjusting magnetic coils. Energy bursts were timed with chants. Even the hum of the reactors had been integrated into hymns. The people didn't question it because the rituals worked. The crops grew under synthetic suns. The weather obeyed their priests. The machines never failed, until, of course, they were meant to. The Foundation understood the value of selective miracles. When a rebellious kingdom threatened to break away, the high priest would declare a day of atonement. Power grids would mysteriously fail. Communications would collapse. Crops would wither under heat lamps turned just a fraction too high. Then, after proper penance and renewed allegiance to the Spirit, everything would return to normal. Miracle restored, order restored. From the outside, this looked like divine justice. From within, it was strategy, a perfect fusion of psychology and technology. The foundation had transformed faith into infrastructure.
But behind this machinery of belief lay a deeper paradox. The leaders of the foundation no longer saw themselves as deceivers. Over time, even they began to absorb the mythology they had engineered. They no longer prayed, but they still spoke of destiny. They no longer believed in gods, but they believed in the plan, a concept equally mystical, equally unprovable. Every society, no matter how rational, eventually reaches for a story to explain itself. The Foundation's story was survival. Its scriptures were Seldon's equations. Its saints were scientists who died ensuring that the lights never went out. And like every story that begins as truth, it was slowly becoming faith. The parallels to our world are uncomfortable. Corporations and nations have learned the same trick. They too convert complexity into belief. The brand becomes a faith, the mission statement a creed. People no longer buy products, they join rituals of belonging. The same way the periphery prayed to the Foundation's reactors, we now pray to the invisible algorithms that govern our feeds, our markets, our memories. We obey what we no longer understand. The Foundation, for all its intelligence, was not an exception. It was a mirror. In time, the priests of the galactic spirit became indispensable intermediaries between the ignorant and the enlightened. Every world had its hierarchies, every temple its bureaucracy. What began as a scientific outpost evolved into a pseudo-religious empire, more stable than the one that had fallen. Its people were devout, its rulers pragmatic, its borders expanding. And yet, within the silence of Terminus, there were whispers. A few scholars remembered the old ways. They spoke of equations, not prayers, of the true purpose of the Foundation. Their words were forbidden. To question the faith was to risk chaos. To expose the truth was to undo everything the plan had achieved. So they stayed silent. And in their silence, the illusion deepened. His name was Loran Division. He had been a priest of the galactic spirit since boyhood. His robes were woven with atomic thread filaments. His sermons reached millions across the star cluster of Smyrno. He had never doubted until the day the machine spoke back. It was a heat converter, ancient and buried beneath the Temple of Light. Its power output had begun to fluctuate. Loran descended into the maintenance vault with 2 acolytes, carrying relic tools and the sacred manual, the Book of Calibration. As he worked, one of the acolytes slipped and fell against a control panel. A hidden plate cracked open, revealing lines of text in a language none of them had ever seen. Loran stared at the symbols. They weren't prayers, they were equations. He didn't understand them, but something inside him shifted. The realization was slow and heavy, like a planet turning. This wasn't divine architecture, it was engineered. The spirit, the miracles, the rituals, all of it was machinery. He tried to dismiss it. He told himself it didn't matter. Faith was still faith, no matter its origin. But the thought wouldn't leave him. Every time he performed a ritual, every time the machine obeyed, he felt the weight of that hidden truth pressing against his words. Weeks passed. The doubt grew. One evening during the Feast of Renewal, Loran delivered the sacred invocation that would cleanse the air processors. As he raised his hands, he saw the technicians in the crowd discreetly adjust the controls. The temperature dropped on cue. The people gasped. They believed. He realized he had become an actor in a play written centuries before his birth. That night, he returned to the vault. He studied the uncovered panels again, tracing the strange letters with his fingers. Eventually, he found a small inscription etched into the metal, half erased by corrosion, property of the Encyclopedia Foundation, Terminus Sector. It was the first time he had ever seen the word foundation outside the context of worship. He began to investigate quietly, gathering fragments of forbidden knowledge. Old blueprints, corrupted data logs, fragments of the Seldon messages. Slowly, he pieced together a story, the story of a colony that once preserved science, not sanctity. The realization shattered him. The spirit he served was a metaphor. The divinity he preached was a disguise. He wanted to tell the truth, but to whom? If he exposed the deception, entire worlds would collapse into chaos. If he stayed silent, he would live a lie. For weeks, he walked the temples, torn between revelation and responsibility. Finally, he decided on a compromise. He began to change his sermons. Subtly, carefully, he replaced the language of blind obedience with the language of curiosity. He spoke of the Spirit not as a god, but as the sum of all human understanding. He encouraged his followers to seek the pattern behind creation. The elders noticed. They summoned him to Terminus for questioning. The journey across the stars gave him time to reflect. He looked at the endless void between systems and wondered if the truth even mattered. The Foundation had survived because it gave people something to believe in. Maybe that was enough. When he arrived on Terminus, he expected imprisonment. Instead, he was greeted by a quiet man in simple clothes who introduced himself as an archivist of the Second Foundation. The archivist smiled. "You've done well, Father Div. The people are beginning to think again. That's the next phase of the plan." Loran blinked. "You mean this was expected?" The man nodded. "Every illusion must one day be replaced by understanding. Faith is only the bridge." Loran laughed softly, half in relief, half in disbelief. "Then the Spirit is real after all, just not how we thought." The archivist looked toward the stars. "Everything that keeps humanity alive is real. Names don't matter. Continuity does." When Loran returned to his parish, he preached one final sermon. He didn't mention Seldon or psychohistory. He simply said, "Knowledge and faith are not enemies. They are the same light seen through different shadows." The people listened, not understanding, but moved. And as he looked at their faces, hopeful, trusting, fragile, he realized that perhaps this was what Seldon had intended all along. A civilization guided not by rulers, but by stories that kept the flame of reason alive, hidden inside belief, waiting for the day it could burn in the open again. In the temples of the periphery, the lights glowed brighter that night. The machines hummed like prayer, and somewhere, deep beneath Terminus, a long dormant vault recorded the data of another successful phase. Hari Seldon's plan was still unfolding. The First Foundation had survived its early centuries through faith. Religion disguised as science kept the galaxy's edges obedient, dependent, and awed. But faith alone could not create wealth, nor could it defend a frontier. Eventually, belief ceded to commerce. The great merchant fleets of Terminus emerged not from piety, but from necessity. The colonies that had once bowed to the priests of the galactic spirit now craved goods, metal alloys, grain substitutes, starship components. The Foundation held the monopoly. Its knowledge of energy conversion and atomic engineering allowed its traders to manufacture everything the periphery needed. And in this dependency, they found their true power. Trade became the new ritual. Merchants replaced priests. The language of contracts, credits, and tariffs became scripture. A single decree from the Foundation could bankrupt a planet or enrich a dozen others overnight. Wealth was no longer measured in devotion, but in influence. The ability to move goods and people faster than rivals, to anticipate needs before they were voiced. Salvor Hardin's successors understood this instinctively. Military conquest was expensive. Faith was fragile. Commerce was absolute. Through the cunning placement of trade hubs, market regulations, and credit systems, the Foundation expanded without firing a single shot. No force could resist a civilization's dependence on what it could not replicate. And yet, as wealth grew, so did ambition. The merchants of Terminus were no longer simple traders. They were power brokers, princes of influence in a universe that still remembered empire, but no longer feared it. Every starship they sold carried not just goods, but leverage. Every contract was a pact, every credit line a leash. The galaxy had entered the age of traders, and in its economy lay the seeds of tyranny. The transition was subtle.
Traders did not overthrow the priests, they absorbed them. A merchant could sponsor a temple, fund a festival, and still retain the power of life or death over a planet. Faith remained, but it was subordinate to the market. Where miracles had once awed, now credit lines dictated obedience. This was Seldon's plan in motion. He had predicted that the Foundation would need to evolve beyond ritual, that commerce would replace piety as the tool of cohesion. But no model could have anticipated the human element, greed, vanity, ambition, the way knowledge, when combined with wealth, could corrupt even the most disciplined society. By the 2nd century of Terminus's colonization, the lines between merchant and ruler blurred. The city-states of the periphery were governed not by elected councils, but by the largest trading houses. Their fleets carried both goods and armies. Diplomacy became commerce. Alliances were forged in balance sheets rather than treaties. The galaxy was quiet in terms of war, but violent in ambition. Credit could crush kingdoms. Markets could destabilize dynasties. Influence became a weapon sharper than any sword. And in the quiet corridors of Terminus's high towers, a new class of rulers emerged, the merchant princes. They were not tyrants in the classical sense. They did not declare themselves emperors. But they controlled everything that mattered: supply, technology, information. A single misstep by one of them could ignite chaos across 1,000 worlds. It was a different kind of empire, one built not on faith or law, but on necessity, desire, and greed. And in that hunger, the universe began to shift. The moral landscape of the age of traders was never black and white. Wars were fought, yes, but not with armies alone. A shortage of grain on one planet could topple governments. A clever monopoly in starship components could redraw borders. Trade agreements became battlefields, contracts the artillery, accountants the generals. Every merchant prince learned to wield power like a blade. They were pragmatic, calculating, morally ambiguous. They understood that the survival of the Foundation required manipulation, but manipulation required ruthlessness. Hober Mallow, one of the most cunning of these trader princes, knew that the periphery would never respect authority, only advantage. And advantage could only be claimed with foresight. The markets were a mirror of the galaxy, complex, interconnected, full of feedback loops. A collapse in one sector could ripple across 10 worlds before anyone realized the chain had started. It was like watching the modern global economy. Nations, corporations, individuals, all entangled in invisible networks. A collapse in credit here, a trade embargo there, and the consequences became almost mythical in scale. Just as today's supply chains tie continents together, the Foundation's commerce wove an intricate web of dependence and control. And yet, even with foresight, uncertainty remained. The equations of trade could not account for every anomaly. Human greed was predictable in bulk, but volatile in small clusters. A single ambition-driven act could break patterns and force adaptation on a massive scale. Mallow understood this better than most. He watched as new traders rose and fell, as colonies prospered and then rebelled, and as religious faith, once a powerful lever, now cowered beneath the weight of commerce. Power was fluid, and those who could grasp the flow became kings in all but name. But with commerce came temptation. The same networks that allowed wealth to flow also allowed corruption, manipulation, and betrayal. The tools that preserved the Foundation could just as easily undo it. In one minor system, a planetary governor attempted to corner the market on synthetic metals. The Foundation intervened, but not with armies. A single subtle embargo, coupled with a promise of future credit, brought the governor to his knees. The system was saved, not by ideology, nor by miracle, but by the cold arithmetic of influence. It was effective, but morally ambiguous. Mallow knew it, and he accepted it. He had to. Survival demanded compromise. In the age of traders, morality was a luxury, not a strategy. And somewhere, beyond these calculations, something entirely new was stirring. The records of the Second Foundation hinted at an anomaly, an unpredictable variable that defied Seldon's mathematics. The galaxy had experienced surprises before, rebellions, disasters, black swan events, but this was different. The anomaly was not an accident of chance. It was intelligent, emotional, powerful beyond the comprehension of the equations. Whispers reached Mallow of a mutant mind, capable of bending loyalty and thought. The very fabric of the plan seemed fragile against it. For the first time, the greatest trader in Terminus felt unease. No ledger, no contract, no clever embargo could control this. And yet, the wheels of commerce continued to turn, unaware. The stage was set. The galaxy was still obedient, still prosperous, still predictable. But the first cracks in the foundation were forming. Mallow sat in his observation tower, overlooking the docks where freighters unloaded shipments of grain, metal, and energy cells. The hum of the engines, the blink of lights, the flow of laborers, it was a perfect system, and yet he felt the itch of doubt. He had mastered trade, outwitted rivals, and survived crises that would have destroyed lesser minds. He had played the markets like a virtuoso plays a violin. And still, something troubled him. Reports arrived from the rim. Small colonies were vanishing from the registry. Ships were being commandeered by unknown forces. Communication lines were failing. A subtle pattern emerged. It wasn't random. Someone, or something, was testing the edges of the plan. He called for a secret council. Around the polished obsidian table sat his closest advisors. Each one was a traitor, a tactician, a subtle manipulator of economies. Mallow outlined what he had observed, every delay, every anomaly, every unexpected outcome. No one had an explanation, yet all felt the same unease. The plan which had guided their rise was showing signs of strain. Later that night, Mallow walked the city streets alone. He watched the laborers, the dock workers, the families dependent on the prosperity he maintained. He wondered what would happen if the invisible thread of commerce snapped. And then he thought of the rumors, a mutant mind, a being capable of controlling emotion, bending loyalty, defying the models that had preserved the galaxy for centuries. Could a single anomaly undo everything? The thought chilled him. For all the cunning, all the power, all the wealth in the galaxy, Mallow realized something terrifying. No ledger, no trade route, no contract could predict the unpredictable. And so he waited. Above, the stars gleamed coldly. Below, the engines hummed their eternal song. And in the quiet spaces between, destiny was shifting. A new player had entered the stage, one that even the Seldon plan could not fully foresee. The age of traders was reaching its peak, and yet the age of tyrants was already dawning. The first whispers of the mule had begun. Trantor, the heart of the first Galactic Empire, had always been a city without end. Its domes stretched beyond the horizon, its spires reached toward the upper atmosphere. And within its depths, millions of lives hummed in precise, controlled chaos. But even the brightest flame casts shadows, and the shadows of Trantor were growing long. The signs of decay had been clear for decades. Bureaucrats bickered over trivialities as vast sections of the planetary infrastructure began to fail. Supplies were rationed, energy grids became unstable, and the once ceaseless machinery of administration sputtered like a failing engine. Senators debated endlessly, their voices echoing through halls that had once resonated with decisive lawmaking. And yet, the Empire's citizens believed, stubbornly, that the city and the civilization it represented would endure forever. But on that final day, belief was not enough. It began with the archives. Massive banks of data containing centuries of imperial records, legal decrees, scientific discoveries, and star charts were systematically destroyed, either by accident or design. Fires erupted in the upper domes, consuming priceless documents. Holographic libraries flickered and died as energy converters failed. The sentient machines designed to manage the city's networks began to malfunction, their synthetic voices reduced to static and warning alarms. The Senate itself descended into chaos. Legislators accused one another of treachery as fires spread across the chambers. The air, once conditioned to perfection, grew thick with smoke and ash. Delegations from outer sectors attempted to intervene, but travel corridors had collapsed. No reinforcements would arrive. No order could be restored. And yet, in the midst of collapse, life continued. Citizens fled through the streets, some carrying belongings, some clutching infants, others moving with frantic purpose that had become instinct over generations. The hum of vehicles, the whine of emergency transport tubes, and the distant clatter of collapsing spires created a symphony of disintegration. The city itself seemed alive, mourning its own demise. Electric lights flickered like dying stars. The monolithic domes, once symbols of permanence, cracked and fell, revealing the naked surface beneath. The colossal bridges and transit systems collapsed into gaping chasms, and still, the heart of the empire beat feebly, desperately, refusing to surrender entirely, even as the end approached. In the command centers, generals and administrators tried to salvage what remained. They attempted to transmit warnings, to coordinate retreats, to preserve data, but every line of communication fractured. Every effort collided with the growing entropy that had been building unseen for centuries. The empire had reached the point of no return, and yet, amid the devastation, a quiet paradox emerged. The very structures that had once guaranteed control now ensured the collapse was measured, not instantaneous. The bureaucracy slowed the fall, giving citizens time to flee, giving the Foundation time to adjust, giving the galaxy the chance to witness the end rather than vanish entirely. It was death in slow motion. When the fires subsided and the last Senate hall burned, Trantor became a hollow shell. The hum of the engines faded, the heat of artificial suns dissipated, and the city, once the pinnacle of human ingenuity, fell silent. The silence was absolute. It was not merely the absence of sound, but the absence of expectation. The empire had endured for 12,000 years, but now there was nothing to remember it by. Only scorched streets, shattered domes, and the cold geometry of abandoned infrastructure. Across the planet, survivors wandered aimlessly. Some tried to restart machinery, only to find that the knowledge required had been lost, hidden within data archives now reduced to ash. Others attempted to establish new councils, but the will to govern had dissipated along with the centralized authority. Civilization had ended, but life persisted in fragile, unpredictable forms. In the emptiness, one could hear the echoes of what had been. Children who had never known the wilderness now walked among rubble, sensing the absence of structure and order. Plants, long neglected, began to creep through cracked flooring. Small animals, previously confined to controlled habitats, explored abandoned corridors. Even the synthetic intelligences, those tireless administrators of the city, began to fail without maintenance, their reasoning corrupted by corrupted circuits. And yet, some things endured. Structures designed to survive centuries, concrete spires, reinforced domes, and magnetic shields stood as silent monuments to ambition. The artifacts of knowledge survived in fragments, scorched data slates, partially functioning hollow recorders, and sealed vaults that had resisted fire and neglect. Within those fragments lay the seeds of memory, the whispers of history waiting to be rediscovered. Philosophically, this silence carried a cruel lesson. Civilizations are not measured by their buildings or armies, but by what they transmit to the future. Knowledge is fragile, faith is fragile, power is fragile, but the consequences of collapse persist. Even the smallest fragment can shape what follows. The first Galactic Empire was gone, but its collapse left imprints across the galaxy. Trade routes fractured, colonies isolated themselves, and the once inevitable influence of Trantor faded into legend. Historians who survived would later describe it as the quietest fall in human history, a planet whose silence spoke louder than any trumpet of victory or defeat. And far across the stars, the Seldon plan quietly adjusted. The foundation, the seed of civilization's rebirth, observed the vacuum left by the Empire. The chaos, the silence, the failure, all were part of the mathematical inevitability Seldon had calculated centuries before. The plan did not mourn, it adapted. In the void left by the collapse, humanity was free, but directionless. And freedom without guidance was both a promise and a peril. On a distant, dying world, a lone scholar monitored the flickering signals from Trantor's ruins. Data lines were sporadic, heavily corrupted, and unreliable. Yet he persisted. He had spent decades gathering what remained: holographic archives, fragmented administrative logs, partial encyclopedias, and transmission records. He knew the end was absolute. He also knew the survival of memory depended on one final act. In a dimly lit chamber, he activated the last transmitter and began a long, unbroken broadcast. His voice, steady and deliberate, carried through space, a final echo of a civilization that had held the stars in its hands. "Attention," he said. "This is a record of what has passed. The Empire has fallen. Trantor is no more. All systems have failed. What remains is the knowledge that we accumulated, the mistakes we made, and the hope that someone, somewhere, will learn from them." He paused to scan his archives. Each file, each fragment represented centuries of ambition, triumph, and human error. "Remember," he continued, "that power is temporary, knowledge fragile, and ambition blind. Learn what you can, preserve what you can, and do not repeat our errors." As he spoke, meteors from interstellar debris struck the planet, shaking the ground beneath his feet. Dust choked the air, the lights flickered, and yet he continued, broadcasting to every reachable system, his final words etched into the void. "Even in the silence of collapse, memory can survive. Even when empires fall, the essence of their existence may echo through time. Guard it, understand it, and prepare for what comes next." The transmission lasted hours, then days. Fragments of it reached the scattered worlds of the galaxy. Some recorded it as prophecy, some as science, some as myth. The scholar himself vanished in the chaos, leaving behind only the broadcast and the hope that his message would endure. Centuries later, his final words would be studied, translated, debated. They would become the foundation of a new philosophy, guiding the scattered remnants of humanity toward reconstruction. In a universe where stars died, systems failed, and civilizations crumbled, one voice had persisted across time and space, a witness to the impermanence of all things. Trantor was gone, the Empire was ashes. And yet, through that final transmission, humanity still had a chance. From the edge of the galaxy, the Foundation received the first fragments of the broadcast. It understood the weight of what had occurred. The Seldon plan, designed centuries before, absorbed the shockwaves of Trantor's fall, adjusting silently, ensuring that even amid ruin, civilization could endure. And somewhere, in the cold and darkness, one question remained. Could humanity learn from its collapse, or would the pattern repeat endlessly, cycle after cycle, until the stars themselves grew silent? The ashes of Trantor still drifted across orbiting satellites when the first freighters of the Foundation arrived at the Outer Rim worlds. They carried no armies, no flags, no banners. They carried knowledge, seeds of civilization carefully preserved against the collapse of the galaxy's greatest empire. Where once the heart of the first Galactic Empire had beat with the certainty of permanence, now there was only silence, empty domes, and scorched streets. Yet from that silence, a new rhythm began, a quiet pulse, measured, deliberate, unyielding. On Terminus, the remaining archivists, scholars, and engineers moved like caretakers in a tomb, cataloging, restoring, and repurposing what had survived. Machines hummed again, not as instruments of power, but as instruments of preservation. Data slates flickered to life. Holographic interfaces projected the forgotten maps of trade, star routes, and the blueprints of ships that had once sailed in fleets of imperial dominance. And through it all, the Seldon plan continued its quiet work, calculating the probabilities of human action, guiding every decision from the shadows, anticipating crises before they became catastrophes. The galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. Across 1,000 worlds, survivors whispered of a new authority, not the Empire of Trantor, but the Foundation. Its rulers, the merchant princes, tempered their ambition with the lessons of history, applying commerce as a tool of cohesion rather than conquest. The priests, the false prophets of faith disguised as science, had long vanished or been absorbed, leaving only the pragmatic structures that ensured survival. And somewhere beyond perception, the Second Foundation observed, their mentalics subtle and invisible, ensuring that anomalies did not derail the careful unfolding of Seldon's grand design. Yet survival came at a cost. Humanity had endured the fall, but it had lost something irreplaceable. Cities that had lasted millennia were gone. Archives that held the voices of entire civilizations had been reduced to fragments. Generations of knowledge had vanished in a day, and with it the uncountable experiences of billions. The plan endured, but the human cost, the lives, the art, the memories, was irretrievable. Civilization could rise, but it would always rise upon the ashes of what had been. In this new dawn, lessons were hard-won. The merchant princes learned to value subtlety over brute force, influence over coercion. The archivists learned to hide knowledge behind layers of myth, ensuring that even the ignorant could be guided, and even the ambitious could be restrained. The Seldon crises, pre-calculated by a mind that had long been dead, continued to appear like silent milestones, each one resolved not by luck but by the precise interplay of foresight and human ingenuity. And yet, even as the foundation rose, a shadow lingered. The galaxy had been altered by the mule, the anomaly capable of bending loyalty and emotion. Though he had not yet fully realized his potential, whispers of his power spread across the worlds, unsettling those who believed themselves safe. It was a reminder that even a plan as meticulous as Seldon's could not account for everything. Fate, free will, chaos, they remained, subtle and unyielding, always ready to test the limits of human order. From the edge of Terminus, Loran Div, the priest-turned-scholar, looked at the new cities forming across once barren worlds. He saw ships lifting off with careful precision, trade routes being re-established, and colonies emerging as fragile oases of civilization in the galactic desert. Yet in his mind, the memory of Trantor's fall lingered. He knew that every rising civilization carried within it the seeds of its own undoing, that the cycle of empire, collapse, and rebirth was endless. Somewhere, in a quiet chamber beneath Terminus, a vault opened. Inside, the messages of Hari Seldon, encoded centuries before, were being read for the first time. They spoke of probabilities, crises, and solutions. They spoke of patience, restraint, and understanding. They were instructions for survival, not instructions for triumph. The plan did not promise glory. It promised continuity. And continuity, in a galaxy as vast and fickle as this, was the rarest and most precious commodity of all. The sun of Terminus rose over the pale fields of reconstructed cities, casting light on streets that had been empty for generations. Children ran through markets rebuilt with care, unaware of the centuries of collapse that had preceded them. Merchants haggled over commodities, unaware that their trade preserved civilization. Priests no longer preached miracles, but teachers still told stories. Stories that traced the arc from Trantor's pinnacle to its ashes and beyond. Civilization was waking again. Yet even in this moment of hope, the galaxy remembered. Shadows lingered in forgotten sectors. Some systems had already begun to fracture. The mule, or some other anomaly yet unseen, could emerge again. The cycle was not broken, it was merely deferred. The foundation, meticulous as it was, could delay the dark age, shorten it, make it survivable, but it could not erase the inevitability of entropy in human societies. And so the 1,000-year dawn began, not as a triumphant victory, but as a cautious promise. Humanity would rebuild. Knowledge would survive, sometimes hidden, sometimes disguised as myth. Civilization would endure, not because the stars were obedient, not because people were perfect, but because those who understood the plan guided it with patience, foresight, and an unwavering commitment to continuity. The ashes of Trantor settled into memory. The foundation rose from them. Humanity learned to dance between chaos and order, guided by the mathematics of masses, yet ever aware of the fragility of every decision. Empires would rise. Empires would fall. But now, at least, they could rise with purpose, with foresight, with a plan. And in the quiet reflection that followed, one question echoed through the minds of the scholars, the traders, and the observers of the plan alike. If every empire must fall, can even our own world escape the same fate?